I'm just waiting for it to connect. Okay, and we will start. Um, hey everyone, welcome back to Live with Madeline, Katie, and Dale, your monthly live show powered by the Simplify Senior Transitions podcast. Today is Wednesday, March 18th, and if you're joining us for the first time, this is where we unpack the real life challenges families face around senior care, housing, financial planning, and everything in between, and give you practical, honest answers you could actually use. So, whether you're helping an aging parent, trying to protect your family from unnecessary stress, or just wanting to understand your options before the crisis hits, you're in the right place. And throughout today's show, we'll also be answering questions and talking through situations that real families deal with every single day. Um, and guess what? This is live. And if you want to submit a question on today's episode, or even a future episode for that matter, you could do that anytime at www.simplifyseniortransitions.com/live. And you know what? There's also a QR code that you should see on the bottom right of your screen. And you could do that. You could scan that code instead as well, and it'll bring you to the same form where you could submit a question. And by the way, when you submit a question, it's done so anonymously because there's nothing in there that asks for your name. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dale Corpus, your host, a senior transition specialist, and I'm a seniors focused real estate expert based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been in the residential mortgage and real estate industry since 2001. That's already over 25 years. So a long time. And I also hold my RCFB administrator certificate. So yes, I help families sell homes, but more importantly, I help them navigate some of the most emotional and complex chapters of life. Things like funding care, downsizing, moving a loved one into assisted living, and avoiding costly mistakes during a transition. A lot of the families I work with are in the sandwich generation, meaning they're trying to take care for aging parents while also raising kids, working, running businesses, and managing their own lives. And that's exactly why we created this show, to give families more clarity, more confidence, and a place to ask the tough questions. And today's topic is one that families avoid talking about until they absolutely have to. It's called final expense planning. What does that mean? We're talking about the costs and the decisions that come up at the end of life. Things like funeral expenses, cremation versus burial, who pays for what, whether insurance can help, and what happens when there's no plan in place. Because the reality is, families are often already grieving when these decisions happen, right? They're emotional, they're overwhelmed. And at the same time, they may be expected to make fast financial decisions. And that's a lot. So, our goal today is to make this conversation a little less uncomfortable and a lot more useful. We want to help families understand what final expense planning actually means, why it matters, and how preparing ahead of time can reduce stress, confusion, and even family conflict later on. And as always, I'm joined by my two amazing co hosts who bring a ton of knowledge and heart to this conversation. So let's do a quick round of intros, at least not for me, but for you two. Katie, can you kick us off?
Sure. Well, it's good to be back. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and sharing your afternoon with us. My name is Katie Perez. I started out my career in the financial professional as a mortgage loan officer. I've been a mortgage loan officer for the last 26 years now. So I've helped a lot of families realize that all American dream of owning a home. The problem was once I got them into their home, I was not in a position to show them how to protect their families should something happen to them. So, moving years later on, after realizing that, I got my life and health insurance license. And now I am able to help families be better prepared for life surprises. And with us this afternoon is another friend of ours in the industry, Madeline Fortich.
Hi, everybody. I'm reporting live from freezing cold Georgia today. Um, I am here in Georgia, uh, and I moved out here because there's a market to help people, just like there's a market to help people everywhere else. But I am a licensed real estate agent realtor with Realty One Group, and I cover California, Arizona, and Georgia now. And I also came with a real estate background. I'm a third generation realtor and realized that helping people find their dreams in a home was really important. But what was also equally as important is helping them protect it. So I got a life and health license as well to help talk about those hard components of planning your legacy and making sure that everything's buttoned up nice and tight. And part of that conversation is dun dun dun, the topic that nobody wants to talk about, which is death. Death and taxes. Those are the two most hated topics for us in this industry. So, we're going to talk about final expense insurance, which falls under the umbrella of life insurance.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about the things that nobody wants to talk about because the reality is, yes, at some point we're all going to leave this earth. And hopefully we will be better planned for it after having our little conversation here today. And Dale, why don't you kick it off with the fabulous questions that I'm
I
sure
will.
everybody has searing in their mind about
Yeah.
final expense?
Yeah, thank you for the intro. So, as I like to say in the beginning of my podcast, let's dive in. First question is this: My parents say they won't. Excuse me. My parents say they don't want to talk about death or funeral planning. How do we bring this up without sounding insensitive?
Let me start off with that one. You know, a lot of certain cultures, I shouldn't say a lot of cultures, but certain cultures don't want to talk about death because they feel or they think that it hastens it.
Right.
That, oh, when you talk about death, it's going to happen. Well, guess what? It will happen whether you talk about it or not. My mom used to tell me that there's two things in life that's guaranteed to happen: death and taxes. And those are the two things people refuse to talk about.
Yeah.
But knowing that it's going to happen, doesn't it make sense to be better prepared for it? I mean, we're not just talking about um, just the financial aspect of it, although that is a very important topic to be considered. But there's a lot involved in planning for that final trip. Like, what does your dad call it, Madeline?
He's on the runway.
The runway. Thank you.
Yeah, he's on the
E-
runway.
exactly. So we know it's going to happen. Why will you let your family guess as to how you want to be sent off?
Right.
Why do you want your family to go through GoFundMe and ask other people to help with that when you knew it's going to happen?
Right.
So I think having that conversation with your loved ones, with your family, is so important because you're not making them guess.
Right.
They'll know exactly what it is you want and how you want it to be executed. And I think that's such a gift to give them for sparing them of the stress of it.
It's true. And I think that there's just an unbearable amount of stress that people don't realize or don't want to realize that will befall them when the time comes that they have to make these decisions. And so, one of the difficulties, like you said, Katie, is that being auditory of having a conversation around death, like you said, potentially could hasten it. And the reality of the situation is just even knowing the framework of how that conversation begins and ends. I've had many a discussion with both my parents, and one is more practical than the other when it comes to it, and the other one refuses to talk about it, which I respect in all aspects the fact that it's even entertained at this moment. Because the reality is, you could go years and never have to have that conversation, but we don't know when that string is going to be pulled. That's your last day. Do you know when your last day here is? I know I don't. But one thing's for certain is that I have vocalized it and I have it written down for the sake that I would like these specific wishes to be respected when my time comes. And so if you don't have the ability to have the conversation, because that's the means that most people think about, there are other tools which are written. Now, for some, they may feel that even writing it down is just not what they want for, but at least it creates the environment to have the conversation. Because something as unplanned or just not even considered for something that is an eventuality for all of us. The day you're born, the next day you begin dying. That's the reality. Is we're all dying. We're all going to die. And I know it's not a popular topic. It is probably the least discussed insurance out of all of the types of insurance that we deal with.
Mhm.
And I think because it's the least discussed, it should be one of the most important ones that comes to the table at some point, because this is something that everyone needs to give, credence to.
Right.
So,
Um,
Dale, what do you think?
so for me, what I've seen, the families who have these conversations earlier, even if they're uncomfortable, usually have a smoother time later on.
Mhm.
And the families that avoid the topic entirely are often the ones who end up guessing, second guessing, and sometimes disagreeing when the time comes, especially like that's where the sibling conflict comes out a lot of times. So to me, this isn't in no way about being insensitive. It's about being responsible. It's about, making sure your loved one's wishes are actually understood um, before like your crazy emotions at that time are running high. Yeah. Um, let's move on to the next one. Here's the next one. Uh, how much does a funeral actually cost today? I hear wildly different numbers.
I think the reason why the numbers are so wildly different is because we don't know where people are.
Yeah.
Your location plays a big part in how it adds up, how the cost adds up, right? And then there's also the cultural practices, the
Right.
religious practices, the personal preference. So I think that all comes into play. Um, it's not so much the dollar amount, it's knowing like the details of how you want it that's going to determine the dollar amount, because it's, again, just like anything else, it's not a one size fits all.
Right.
When somebody plans for um their final expense, it really depends on how they see uh their last trip to be.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so different, it's so varied. Maddie, have you looked into it recently? I know you've got a big family.
Yes, I do have a tribe for a family, and the reality of the situation is it is a very touchy subject, but I've heard very recently within the last 6 months, somewhere upwards of 16,000 to a very basic, what would be considered more basic funeral service, as high as 26,000. And that all depends. Like, are they going to be interred? Are they going to be in a casket? Is it going to be cremation? Is there an urn? Are they going to be shot into outer space? I mean, there's my least favorite, the green burial, which, as much as we are compostable, I hate to think that we are, and the costs that are involved there, because the reality is inflation is real, and as costs go up, everything goes up.
Mhm.
And like you said, just the locale of where you live
Right.
affects how expensive it can be.
Mhm.
So, for all of those things, planning is my biggest key conversation there. Plan it as best as you can. And, it's not something as front and center as some of the other types of insurance, as I've mentioned, but because it's the least desirable conversation topic, maybe it should
Right.
be one that's tackled earlier rather
Mhm.
than later.
Here's one that just came in on the website. Is it selfish for children to ask their parents to plan their final expenses ahead of time? This one's pretty emotional. Like probably gonna be one of the more emotional questions in the
Yeah.
episode.
Earlier we were talking about the parents being insensitive about it. Um, and we said that it's their way of showing loving for their family by preventing any disruption in family relationships, right, when they're gone. I think the same could be said about the children asking their parents to plan for it, because I would see it as being respectful and mindful of their wishes.
Right.
We don't know, we're not mind readers, right? So we don't know how parents envision it. One parent might like to be cremated, one doesn't. One might have a preferred final resting place than the other. When my husband and I were preparing for ours, um I envisioned a lovely spot in the memorial park where there's a tree, there's a bench, you can hear water. And I envisioned, oh, my daughter's going to visit and keep me company, you know, remember her mom. And my husband thought about, oh, I'm just going to get a cubicle, get myself cremated, and
Right.
put me in there, right? So, and this is us talking about it. So, can you imagine if my husband and I didn't talk about it and made decisions? How difficult that would be for my child,
Right.
right? So it's so important that it's not being insensitive, it's not being disrespectful. If anything, it's the opposite. We're being very sensitive to how they want to be remembered and how they want to be sent off.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And I say that because, when I think back to the conversations that I have had with one parent versus the other, the biggest question always comes down to, so do you guys not want to be together when this, like, how is this all gonna how is
Mhm.
this all gonna pan out? And like you mentioned, Katie, I come from a very large family. And the thought process there is, um, my two seniors travel a lot. They travel
Mhm.
frequently. They're out and about, and one of my greatest fears was, what if something happens while they're traveling? Because how am I going to get them
Mhm.
home, so to speak,
Yeah.
or to their final place? And you know how when you're traveling, you may buy travel insurance, right? And in the very fine print at the very bottom, it's like, well, if you happen to biff it during your trip, like, how are you going to get that deceased body back to where they came from?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you run into a plethora of things that you may not have ever had to determine in your life. Like,
Right.
how is that trip going to come back into the United States? And these are real fears that I have. And
Mhm.
that's why final expense insurance was something that was so important as the child, and the parents. My parents decided that, we want to take this off her plate, which I'm super grateful for. And these are why we have these conversations. But still, and yet, the question becomes, you can only plan as best as you can with
Mhm.
the knowledge that you have. And if you have
Mhm.
no exposure to it at all, who would have ever thought that, do you need to get a visa for someone who's no longer breathing?
That's
Do
true.
they need a passport? Like, these are real
Right.
questions that
That's true.
come up,
Right.
right?
That's true.
And I think that the other added benefit to final expense insurance is that certain carriers may offer a service that helps the family make these decisions, and kind of like your project manager for this situation, where, what is it? Connoisseur service, right?
Yes.
Where they help you process this, because as much as we believe that we're going to be functioning in some way when this horrible event happens,
Right.
you're grieving.
Right. Right.
Everyone would love to believe that they can still function in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
But you know I don't think it is insensitive to make these conversations known. I think it's the sooner the better. I told my mom, I said, if you don't really want to talk about it, write it down, put it somewhere, store it with your living trust documents. You don't have to auditorily tell me these things, but I also have a sibling that I have to consider. And, you make these decisions together, hopefully. But I
Mhm.
often have seen that, unfortunately, when somebody dies, grief takes over and it gets the best of all of us. And
Yeah.
sometimes it turns into, it's already a bad situation. You don't want it to get worse.
Right.
Right.
We've time and time again, we keep on bringing up value versus cost,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
right? And people usually don't like to have that conversation because they think, oh, it's expensive.
Right.
But the thing there is that there's value added service that a final expense plan provides.
Right.
Mhm.
Like to your point, Madeline, there's a lot of seniors that are traveling now. If I just got back from a vacation a few weeks ago, and I was surprised to see the number of wheelchair that's required in every trip. It just seems like it's more and more because people are living longer.
Yes.
They have more means to do so now that they're retired, right? And they wanna enjoy life. And part of enjoying life is seeing other places or visiting family in other countries, right? So there's more of that. So the concern about what will happen should their final trip be that trip. Then that's where some final expense providers can come in because they can help you walk you through the logistics of what's involved because you don't know what you don't know.
Yep.
It's happening most likely for the first time to us.
Hopefully the last time.
Well,
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah.
there's something to be said about the value services that having your final expense insurance in place also to consider.
Cool.
Mhm.
Um, moving on. Next question here is, what happens if someone dies and there's no money set aside for funeral costs?
Oh boy. It's really unfortunate when it does happen, but I think the most popular response to that is the GoFundMe route. I
Uh-huh.
mean, in some cultures, people participate by giving envelopes of monetary donation to help if they were part of a community or practice uh, in a religious church or religious community. Maybe their community, the congregation would take that on.
Yeah.
Um, I've seen that happen in a lot of situations where the congregation comes together and helps with the cost. Family is what you hope for. Sometimes it's not what happens, though. And the common response is public outcry to the likes of a GoFundMe in the hopes that there will be generosity that's given to somebody who unfortunately didn't plan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a sad situation. I actually witnessed a family whose mother passed unexpectedly, and the family was not prepared.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of concerns, and the children were under a lot of stress because they didn't have the resources needed. They didn't know how they were going to come up with the money for the final resting place, for the viewing. And for that particular culture, there's a 9-day novena that takes place.
Mm.
That's 9 days of hosting people who are paying their final respects.
Yeah.
So some family members opted to not go back and pay their final respect and instead send their monetary contribution. It's a practical way of doing things, but um I'm sure they would have preferred to be able to go back and pay their final respects, and they probably would have preferred not having to make a choice of one over the other. So
Yeah.
It's a tough
Yeah.
choice.
mhm.
It is. Um, Here's our fifth and final question. It is cremation becoming more common because of cost?
I think so. I think there's that. Plus certain religions are more receptive
Right.
to recognizing cremation. The only requirement is find a final resting place. Don't put them on your mantle, or don't take it along with you wherever you go as a
What?
carry-on.
I'm totally doing that. Are you kidding me? The portability is a big factor for me. I
Right.
mean, my folks still travel, and they'll travel with me until I'm ready to
Come
give
see
them
the
up.
world with me
Yeah,
from
come
another
see
Uh,
the
point of view.
world. You'll need a certificate, I'm sure, to board a plane with that. Human cremains, no thank you. But yeah, I have to say that portability is something that is of value to certain people, because I, for one, move frequently, and the thought of having the final resting place be determined, it's not my choice. It will
right.
be my loved one's choice, right? And you think about it, but that goes back to the conversation of, with lack of planning, tends to be looser rules about keeping the family members hanging out in the guest bedroom, or
Right.
they're not returned to the earth should certain religions require, right? And because there are no instructions, I feel like there's latitude there, that people are like, oh well, I could just
Yeah.
continue doing this, and
Hmm.
they'll celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas with me next year. And, because there's no deadline, right? There's
Right.
no hard stop to it. And I also think with the grieving process, because nothing is written down or expressed, that latitude can be taken to those extents.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the reason why it is that way. But you're right. I think that the acceptability, I'm Roman Catholic, grew up that way. Uh, that has also probably affected some people's decisions to
Yeah.
opt for the cremation route.
Hmm. Hmm.
Definitely, cost factors that can be considered, but it is the most important thing to have that conversation, because again, what is more horrifying than somebody cremating somebody who never intended to be cremated,
Right.
even,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Or their wishes are maybe disregarded in their last days, right?
Hmm.
Right.
Open casket, closed casket, these are things that are important to have a conversation about. And I know that most people probably don't want to talk about it. So again, you can write down what you want. I specifically have told all my loved ones how I would like my final resting situation to be. And I did that because at least then there's no confusion later on. The expectation is already set that that's what I would like for, and I would hope that it would be honored because I had verbalized it and written it down in my living trust.
Right. Um, Very good. And all right, you know what? Next up is, let's get into one of our favorite parts of the show. It's called Fact or Fiction. Um, this is where we take some of the biggest myths and misconceptions around today's topic and break them down. And honestly, this is usually the part where people realize just how much confusion there is out there. And just for sake of time, I'll just probably do a few of these actually. Here's the first one. The first one is fact or fiction. The average funeral today can cost over $10,000.
Easy.
Yes.
Easy. Very
Sorry,
easy.
Yeah,
I pressed my button first.
right, right. I think
My buzzer's not
this
working.
one does surprise people a lot because funeral costs, they've obviously risen
Oh,
significantly over the
yes.
years. Inflation, obviously, and as you know how this goes, is most families haven't priced this out yet until it actually happens, and like that's when they're
Yes.
finding it out for the very first time, right? And
Hmm. I
Yeah.
was
okay,
shocked. I was shocked when my husband and I were making our preparations. This was a few years ago. We decided to buy our final resting place because it was during COVID, and there's a lot happening around us, and we
yeah,
didn't want to. We thought it's like, let's do this now because we don't know. There was a lot of uncertainty during that time, right? And
right,
so we decided to get cremated. We purchased our spot, right?
right,
And this was about 5 years ago,
Yeah.
just for that spot, it was more than $10,000.
Wow.
Wow.
That doesn't
Yeah.
include anything else.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
Um, Here's another fact or fiction. Actually, this is going to be the last one, just for sake of time. Fact or fiction: final expense insurance is only for seniors.
No.
No, no. I think for it's we don't want to think about it for our children,
Right.
right? Of course, we want our children to live a long, happy, healthy, successful life,
Hmm.
right? Unfortunately, we don't know,
Yeah.
right? Now, there are policies out there, juvenile policies out there, that, depending on the face value,
Right.
has a built-in final expense plan. There's that. Um, so it's not just for seniors. That's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Mhm.
I completely agree with that statement. It's not just for seniors. And again, just like with anything else, it's have the conversation with your trusted advisor
Right.
because they will be the resource for you. And at the same time, as much as it's a difficult conversation, it is very necessary because here you go, you plan your life accordingly, and nobody really knows when that last day will be.
Mhm.
But if you don't have it ironed out, written somewhere, I always look at it from the standpoint of the best way you can show love and care for your family is to make those decisions, take that initiative to make sure that they're aware of what your wants are so
Right.
that they don't have to do it when they're under duress. And the one
Right.
thing that I explained was that with final expense, it falls under the umbrella of life insurance. And you think about it in this term, which is for all those happy events that you celebrate, a child being born, a wedding taking place. These are individuals that more than likely will be the same ones notified when somebody leaves this earth, except for you are now condensing that into 7 days, 10 days of
Right.
planning,
Right.
Right.
and you don't have the luxury of 1 year to plan a wedding.
Right.
This is something that typically happens abruptly and decisions have to be made. And duress is an understatement of what occurs to those loved ones when they have to make those choices. So, to alleviate that, the best course of action would be to plan.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's the
True.
best that you can hope for. And that's hopefully something that you, the audience, at least got some of the myths dispelled today.
Right.
And it gives you a way to have these conversations and address what's really important, because I find that it's probably the least favorite of topics,
Mhm.
but it's ultimately necessary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
True.
And as we wrap up, any final words? Can't be too long though. If I say like, who's got it? Yeah, who's got final words?
I have a story to share
Yeah, go ahead.
with the group here, and our viewers. It's actually it's a true story. It happened in my family. When my dad was starting out in his career, a very wise advisor suggested, preparing for your financial future. And my dad had aging parents at that time, and so he bought a memorial plan. A memorial plan. It was a new concept back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, I believe.
Hmm.
And so he was making payments to it. He didn't bother to discuss it with my grandmother because he thought, well, I'll take care of this for her. Doesn't have to worry about anything, and it's just something that needs to be done, right? Didn't think anything of it. Well, years later, when the plan was finally paid off in full,
Hmm.
Oh no.
my grandmother received a letter, a notification saying that her memorial plan has been completely settled. It's now good. It's in force now. It's like, oh, my grandmother was so livid. I mean, mind you, she's an older generation. She's just part of the
Yeah.
older generation Filipino, and she was so livid. The stories that comes out of family gatherings about her reaction, it's epic. It's like, so, but years later, I mean, not years later, but it took time. It definitely took time for family members to let her know, remind her that this is his way. This is a very loving way that your son is preparing for your future. He wants to be able to send you off with dignity and respect. And when she finally passed away about 40, 45 years later, that's exactly how she was sent off. We were able to have enjoy the company of those family members, friends that pay their respects to her. We were able to laugh at the stories about her, recalling how adventurous my grandmother was, or what a mischievous lady she was. So it was fun. It was great because we didn't have to worry about, is this how she would have wanted it?
Right.
How are we going to pay for this? There was no conversation around that. Are we going to wait for people to donate? There wasn't any concept of that.
Right.
We were allowed to actually have a real celebration of her life. And to me, I would want to be sent off with that amount of love and dignity when it's my time.
That's a great story, and I hope that he was forgiven at some point.
He was. He was.
I can only imagine the look on her face when she received that. It's horrifying.
And she's a very spirited lady. So you can just imagine.
I bet. The haunting is real, believe me. Every time I bring up this topic, all I think to myself is, yeah, if I don't do this right, I'm going to be haunted. It's going to happen. That's what's going to happen. Make your choices, lay it out how you like.
Pick your poison.
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
Madeline, how about you? Any final words?
My final words are probably as simple as planning. Just make sure it gets planned, it gets discussed at some point. With the rising costs that we're experiencing year over year, the inflationary things that affect how our lives are being led, I think there's something to be said about peace of mind of knowing that you've taken care of everything that needs to be taken care of. Yeah. And that is the best way to show love to your loved ones. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, take those moments to have those conversations whenever you see a break, to actually have those conversations with your loved ones. And the funny part is, Katie, you mentioned it earlier about, your loved ones getting to make those decisions. I actually had that conversation of, when you make these considerations, sometimes the loved ones are the ones that you exclude out of those conversations for the sheer sake that you love them, but they're not capable of making those choices for you. Mm-hmm. So to help them, you make the choice already by laying it out so that they have instructions to follow.
Exactly.
Yeah. 100. If this was a text message, I'd send you that 100 emoji. So
what would my emoji be?
Oh no. Yeah. I'll send you a happy face one. You're always laughing. Yeah. Hey, guess what, guys? That's a wrap. Wow. So that's a wrap for this month's episode of Live with Madeline, Katie, and Dale. Huge thanks to my amazing co-hosts, Madeline Fortich and Katie Perez. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined us live and everyone who continues to support the show. If we didn't get your question in today, don't worry. We may bring it in a future episode. And if you want to submit a question for an upcoming live show, you can even do that anytime at www.simplifyseniortransitions.com/live. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out the Simplify Senior Transitions podcast, where we go deeper into real conversations around senior care, housing, financial planning, family dynamics, and all the things, families face during later life transitions. And if you're a family navigating a senior transition right now, whether that means downsizing, exploring care options, figuring out how to pay for care, one of the best next steps you could do is by starting at www.simplifyseniortransitions.com/families. And if you're a professional, whether you're in senior living, real estate, legal services, or a related field, and you'd like to connect, collaborate, or learn more about my referral network, go to www.simplifyseniortransitions.com/professionals. Thanks again for spending a part of your day with us. We appreciate you, right, guys?
Yes, we
Absolutely.
do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we'll see you on the next episode. Bye for now.
See you
Bye.
later.
All right.